Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Westfield Promise. How you guys doing? It's me, Bob. It's good to see you. Well, it will be on Wednesday when I come by to see you. If you're watching this video after that, we've already met. But I'm looking forward to our time today. We're going to be heading over to talk about your first chapter of Wallerstein. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, Wallerstein is the man. Is the godfather of he is the godfather of the world systems theory, and we're going to read the first chapter of the first book in the four-book series, The Modern World System. The title of this chapter is Medieval Prelude, and as it suggests, what Wallerstein is going to do is he's going to start by introducing us to the concept of the world system, which I kind of previewed in the last video. So you get a sense of that, and then he's going to begin to walk us through what are some of the elements that are kind of churning and bubbling within late feudalism that is going to contribute to the emergence of early capitalism and the existence of this world system and the transition into what we call the early modern period of the 16th century. A transition that is a monumental change for the globe in effect. This is not simply a transition that is regional, like the fall of the Roman Empire. Very drastic, very well known, very talked about transition from that ancient Western European world to a medieval Western European world, or the beginning of that process. That is ultimately a regional phenomenon. The collapse of the Roman Empire was felt keenly in Italy. It was felt keenly in what would become France, what was then called Gaul. It was felt keenly in North Africa. It was felt keenly in Greece. No one in China cared. Had no effect on anyone in China, anyone in the subcontinent of India. No one cared. Totally just went by. Maybe news came out. Oh yeah, this thing way the hell out in Europe fell apart. Okay, what's next? The world system that emerged after the collapse of feudalism is something that's felt by everyone around the world eventually, to the point where the world we live in today, capitalism has totally captured all of it. There is virtually not a single human being on the planet that is not a subject of capitalism and that has not been forced to belong to a legally defined nation state. That is the effect that this world system has had. It has transformed all of us into the singular subjects, or the individual subjects of this world-spanning system, and we are forced, all of us, to contend with it. Whether you're a student in a Holyoke High School classroom, or whether you are working at a factory in Shanghai in China, or you're working in an IT call center in Mumbai, or you're working on an oil field in Iran. We are all subjects of this capitalism, and we all dance to this world systems tune. If that is the case, if we must navigate all of our lives through a negotiation with the powerful within this world system, I believe it behooves us to understand its origins. I believe it behooves us to understand its operations and to begin a process whereby we can actually begin to understand and contend with the forces that are at work on our lives. All right. So Wallerstein's an interesting author, and every one of his chapters in this text begins with some piece of physical art, right? Normally an engraving or a painting. And in this case, it is an engraving. It is a print engraving called The Fox Hunt, by an anonymous German artist from the late 15th century. And in it, Wallerstein is choosing it, I believe, because it depicts the physicality of the old manor system with the manorial house where the noble who ruled over the land lived, the village where the peasants lived, the mill that ground their grain into flour so they could make bread, the forest that was inhabited by the deer belonging entirely to this noble in the front, the hangers-on and retainers and larger kind of extended family of that noble in the foreground, and in the background we can see the toiling peasantry up on the hill. Really, the only figure that is missing is the clergy. But you can see the church, the village church there, in the kind of foreground of the church, right about there. But what Wallerstein is using this to do is it kind of depicts a vista of most of what medieval life looked like from Eastern Europe all the way up to the borders of Scotland, from Seville in Spain all the way across to Hungary. Wallerstein begins talking about his overall thesis, right? These first few chapters that these first few pages, he is going to go over the overview of the world system, right? So hopefully you've watched the video that I recorded over the weekend. That will kind of give you a little bit of a primer to begin to understand what Wallerstein is talking about here. In particular, a couple things I want to point out. He talks about there are other world systems besides the European world system that comes to dominate the globe. However, as he points out, all of them, with the exception of Europe, became empires. And so at that point, their development stopped. They were united politically under a gigantic, overwhelming state apparatus, and that became the central focus of economic activity, right? That became the hub around which the economy spun. That was the controlling arm of the economy. Now, the production, of course, is happening at the level of the farm and the the workshop, but the controlling mechanism for economic decisions is centralized in the hands of the emperor or the empress and the court that surrounds them. That is not true in capitalism. Capitalism has no central controlling mechanism. It is one of the reasons why it is such a chaotic and often difficult to understand system. It's why we have to have people who have PhDs in economics and they still can't tell us what's going to happen. It's why people get degrees in finance, because the vicissitudes, right? The random kind of flighty movements of the capitalist world economy are so chaotic that it almost beggars understanding at a certain level. There's no one in charge. There's no hand on the tiller. Adam Smith, who was kind of an early describer of capitalism in the 18th century, talks about the invisible hand of the market, right? Adam Smith talks about the invisible hand, and that invisible hand is his description of the collection, the aggregate of all of these individual economic decisions by people at various levels of the market, by people who are, powerful capitalists, people who are, money managers in the kind of the middle, people who are simply workers and consumers at the bottom. The aggregate of all those decisions becomes what we know as the market, right? And some people have a much larger voice in those decisions or in driving those market behaviors, but no one has control, okay? That is what differentiates the European world system that dominates the globe from all other world systems that preceded it, right? No hand on the tiller, or rather, an invisible hand that is the aggregate of all of these decisions, right? Moving in seemingly random patterns like birds murmurating across the sky, right? If you've ever seen a flock of birds move across the sky in kind of random patterns, that's, not dissimilar sometimes to the way that the market behaves. So it goes on and talks about empires, this constant feature of world history. What capitalism, and this is a really important point, what capitalism does offer is an alternative, a more lucrative source of surplus appropriation, right? At least more lucrative over the long run. An empire is a mechanism for collecting tribute, right? Much as Frederick Lane's poignant image means payment received for protection, but payments in excess of the cost of producing the protection. In a capitalist world economy, political energy is used to secure monopoly rights, or narrow as can be, and the state becomes less the central economic enterprise than the means of assuring certain terms of trade. This is important. The state becomes less the central economic enterprise than the means of assuring certain terms of trade in other economic transactions. So the state, rather than being the central controlling mechanism of the economy, rather simply becomes a guarantor of things like contract law. We're going to talk a lot about this when we talk about the creation of the modern state in weeks to come, but it's important. He's introducing the idea here, so I wanted to talk about it. The state becomes a means of assuring certain terms, right? So if you and I go into business together as independent capitalists, we're not looking for the state to tell us what the price of our goods should be. What the state's job is to, if we make a contract together, to be the guarantor of that contract. And this is where the courts come in. This is where civil court comes in, where one party can sue another party for violation of contract, right? He talks about the origins and functioning of a 60-day European world economy in the 16th century, right? The idea of like product moving, like you can follow product from one end of Europe to the other, and the most it's going to take to get from one end to the other is 60 days. I mean, it's shrinking the world in terms of time traveled, right? And as the world economy becomes more important to the daily lives of the people that live in Europe, those times start to shrink even further. Because as capitalism begins to penetrate down into the lives of workers, and it doesn't just exist in this kind of like doesn't just exist as this kind of parasitic patina on the edges of feudalism, there becomes much more agency in the hands of capitalists to start to make the world one in which they can maximize profit. Right? Maximization of profit is the key. Interestingly, when he finally gets to talking about feudalism in page 17, he doesn't define it in positive terms. He doesn't say what feudalism is. He starts by saying this is what it's not. And one of the things he says is feudalism is not a natural economy, right? He says it is not an economy of self-subsistence, right? Western European feudalism grew out of the disintegration of an empire, a disintegration which was never in total a reality or even de jure. This is true, and if you study medieval history, one of the things that all of the kings of medieval Europe are obsessed with is becoming like some kind of simulacrum of the Roman Empire, aping their dress, or aping their style, or aping their aesthetics, or aping their language. It's why Latin was the language of the learned all the way up into the early modern era, because people were obsessed with Rome, and Latin became this kind of symbol for this greatness. So he says this isn't a natural system that grows out of some kind of like ingrained way of being. It is a response to the collapse of a state imperial system. And in that collapse, and especially the collapse of the military institutions that sustained that empire, an agreement is kind of forged between the peasantry and the landholding nobility that allowed the peasantry to leave their enslavement status behind and to achieve a kind of middling freedom as village peasants, as bound labor. They were not free; they couldn't leave the land, but they were not owned in body. They could not be bought and sold. Their children could not be bought and sold. They had customary rights and duties. They had customary privileges, and those privileges were well protected. Peasants would protect them with tooth and claw. They, as a result, worked far less than their enslaved ancestors, and in many important ways, worked a lot less than the rural workers, the proletarians who worked the fields for wages and or paying rents would work after them, right? So there's this very long period when the peasantry are able to kind of carve out particular protections, not because they were able to appeal to some higher power, quite the opposite, because there was no higher power, because the guy ruling over you was a lord who had to deal with you, who lived locally. If we go back to the top, them's the peasants. That's where the lord lives. It's not very hard to imagine a scenario where this fancy dum-dum makes a really dumb decision, pisses off all of these people, and they march up to his house and light it on fire, right? When your workers, when the people you're exploiting live right down the road from you, you do two things. Number one, you build walls around your house. And number two, you work really hard not to piss them off. Peasant revolts are not uncommon. When they do happen in medieval Europe, they are extraordinarily violent because the peasants know exactly who they're fighting and what they're fighting for. So when the peasants go into a manor house to kill the lord, they don't just kill the lord. They kill the lord, they kill his wife, they kill his kids, they kill his servants, they burn the records, and they burn the whole goddamn thing down. And then when somebody rides in to see what happened, they're out in the field like, yeah, it was crazy. We don't know. Wild. I don't know, man. Just these guys came by and just torched everything. Yeah, we got barley to sow. So yeah, I mean, tell us who the next guy is. And so peasants in that way were able to negotiate from a position of relative strength a relatively comfortable and a lifestyle for themselves. Certainly more comfortable than the slaves, their enslaved ancestors that had preceded them under the Romans. He says, what should we envision then when we speak of Western European feudalism? A series of tiny economic nodules whose population and productivity were slowly increasing, in which the legal mechanisms ensured that the bulk of the surplus went to the landlords. So as much of the surplus was in kind, it was of little benefit unless it could be sold. Towns grew up supporting artisans who brought the surplus in exchange for their products, and so on and so on. So what you begin to see is the emergence within feudalism of these kind of alternative classes, right? Not just peasants and nobles, but these other kind of middling sort, right? The small merchants, the artisans, right? The people who are willing to trade in an expertise in either commercial activity or in making of beautiful and useful things in exchange for some of that food surplus that the landlords have collected. Right? And those people tend to live in towns. He says feudalism shouldn't be thought of as antithetical to trade. I think a lot of merchants would disagree with that. It's not antithetical to trade. In fact, it requires trade to exist, but it's not a system that is built for trade. It is not a system that is built to help merchants. Merchants are not considered when one is thinking about how feudalism or how one's feudal relationships with one's peasants should be organized, or how one's feudal relationship with the church should be negotiated, or how one's feudal relationship with one's king should be organized. You don't really think about that. You don't think about, or rather, you don't really think about the merchants. They don't matter under feudalism. And that's the point. They are peripheral, they are secondary. They're nice, it's good to have them. Merchants mean you can get better wine than you normally could have. Merchants mean you can get better types of steel in certain places in Europe. Merchants mean you can get fancier armor and better crossbows, and these spices from the east, these delicacies like cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg and pepper. But they're not necessary. They don't make anything. So they kind of just exist in the periphery, right, for most of the medieval period. Until feudalism begins to come to a profound crisis. That crisis, in short, is the Black Death. And Wallerstein talks about the population declination that occurs in the 13th century, which is going on. The population is beginning to decline in the 13th and into the 14th century because they're running out of land, right? The expansion of the manorial system, the expansion of the cultivation of crops has reached a natural limit, and now the population is beginning to feel that crunch. The production of food is beginning to slow, or rather, I should say, the expansion of the production of food is beginning to slow, so the population is beginning to stagnate and even in some places decline. But the real decline in population occurs when this terrible illness, passed by the fleas that ride on the backs of rats, arrives in Europe on these Genoese merchants from the Black Sea who carried aboard their ships. It had already hit China and Central Asia with terrible effect. It was currently racing through medieval Islamic world, and now was going to be visited upon Europe of the 14th century. And it kills about 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe. And the destruction of such a massive amount of the population leads to an absolute crisis in labor. The old labor relationships of, we hold you to the land, we collect a very set amount of surplus that's carved in stone, you work 180 days a year, you get all these saints days and feast days and all that stuff off, you're protected in your use of the forests and the commons and the wastes to graze your pigs and your cows and your sheep and your goats. You're allowed to fish in the rivers, you're allowed to go out into the forests and collect firewood, all those kinds of privileges that the peasants have. None of that is tenable anymore. You have entire villages that are wiped out, entire sections of community that are wiped out. And actually, this expansion that had been going on since the 7th century begins to shrink, right? Begins to shrink back down. That is preceded by about a century of increasing stagnation, right? So it's like stagnation, 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 creak, 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 blip, collapse with the Black Death. Wallerstein makes a point, which is, I think, interesting on page 22, when he's talking about this. He says, stagnation is, on the face of it, a curious consequence. One might have expected the following scenario. A reduced population leads to higher wages, which, with rents relatively inelastic, meaning they're set in stone. Because if you raise the rents on your peasants, you better have a private army in which to put them down when they rise up. So the rents remain relatively inelastic while wages are going up because there's fewer workers, which would mean a change in the composition of demand, shifting part of the surplus from lord to peasant, meaning peasants would be able to keep more of what they grew, and hence ensuring that less of it would be hoarded. Furthermore, a reduction of population in an economy that was largely agricultural should have led to parallel reductions in demand and supply. But since typically a producer will normally reduce production by eliminating the less fertile plots, there should have been an increased rate of productivity, right? Less land is under cultivation by fewer farmers. That means less stress on the soil. It's the biome can heal, right? You can shift your crops around. You don't have to have all of your fields planted simultaneously just to keep up with the growing population of your village. You can rotate your crops, right? What they call the 3-field system, right? You have one field for growing grain, another field for growing another grain product like rye or barley, and then a third field left fallow. There should have been an increased rate of productivity, which should have reduced prices. Both of these developments should have encouraged, not discouraged trade, right? Reduced prices, higher wages, more surplus in the hands of peasants. It should have been a bonanza for the workers of Europe. But what went wrong with the calculation is in the implicit assumption about the elasticity of demand. He mentions 2 authors. North and Thomas remind us that given the state of the technology and the range of the volume of international trade, transaction costs were very high. And any reduction in volume due to decline in population would set in a process of rising costs, which would lead to further reductions in trade. So the whole problem with the feudal period is it's not designed for commerce. Meaning, number one, there aren't good roads, which sounds stupid, but it's actually a real problem. You cannot get stuff from point A to point B very easily. So there's no good roads. The port facilities for ships are rudimentary at best. The ships themselves are very primitive. The medieval cog cannot carry vast amounts of product. It carries a very small, very tiny amount of product in comparison to even an early modern trading ship. So the costs of moving stuff from point A to point B are very expensive, which means it has to be very valuable or it's not worth the candle, right? You're not going to ship bulk items from point A to point B when the price that you can expect to get on the other end is quite low. They trace the process like this. Previously, merchants found it profitable to reduce transaction costs by stationing factors in distant cities to acquire information about prices and possible trading opportunities. Let's say I'm from Milan, right? And I'm going to station one of my guys in Flanders, and he's going to write to me once a week and tell me what the price of wool is doing. I've got another guy in York who's buying wool from those merchants and holding it until the price in Flanders, in Antwerp or Ghent, goes up. And then I send him a letter and say the price has gone right in Antwerp or in Ghent, send it off, right? To distant cities to acquire information about prices and possible trading opportunities. As the volume of trade shrank, this was no longer expedient. Information flows dried up and trade volume was further reduced. It is thus not surprising that economic historians found the depression, and for them meaning a decreased total volume of economic activity, even in the midst of this world where higher per capita income would presumably have followed relative increases in real wages that peasants and workers must have been experiencing. Merchants weren't set up to sell in large quantities to a volume audience. They were set up to sell in small quantities, very valuable products to very rich people, right? The typical high-level merchant of the Middle Ages was a merchant in spices, selling exceedingly small amounts of pepper to extremely rich idiots for massive amounts of money, right? That is the typical high-end medieval merchant. They don't have the technology, and here we're going to talk about technology a lot. They don't have the technology to sell to a volume market, right? To a volume customer base because they can't move that much product, right? Now, when we get into the 16th century, we start to see the construction of turnpikes. We start to see the construction of high-level port facilities. We start to see the construction of larger and larger ships and more reliable ships that can move large amounts of product to market to sell to a popular customer base. But you don't have anything like that in the Middle Ages. That did not exist. Why would you sell to peasants? They don't have any money. And the collapse of the population collapse of the Dark Ages, or sorry, of the not Dark Ages, excuse me, of the Black Death is so profound that it catches everybody off guard. And there's this period between the end of the 14th century, right, the late 1300s, and kind of the end of the 15th century, this 100-year period, where the merchant class is playing catch up. But once it does, then it very quickly becomes one of the dominant players in the game. It goes from being this kind of ancillary side character, selling boutique items, for, facilitating the needs of the rich aristocrats, to becoming, in certain specific places, the dominant class within society. Those specific places we talked about last time: Milan, Florence, Venice, Genoa, right? To a lesser extent, and a little bit later on, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Ghent, Cologne, Augsburg, Rouen in France, Caen in France, Hamburg, right? The northern German cities, which are known as make up what's called the Hanseatic League, all those northern German cities, those merchant cities that we looked at, those form something called the Hanseatic League. It is in those places, Prague, can't forget Prague. It is in those places that during the 15th century, you start to see the bourgeoisie, the merchant class, beginning to stretch into its new role, beginning to stretch and take advantage of these new economic opportunities, and becoming more and increasingly powerful players in this political game, right? So that is the big transition, is the Black Death, right? It cracks feudalism at its foundations, and the weeds of capital kind of grow in through the cracks. He talks about R.H. Hilton's he talks about R.H. Hilton. He says, to find the spot I wanted to talk about. He says, furthermore, he suggests that Perroy omits any discussion of another phenomenon which resulted from events Perroy described, which to Hilton are central: that of the unusual degree of social conflict, the climate of endemic discontent, the peasant insurrections, which took the form of revolts against the social system. We see many of these during the Black Death. Any kind of transition, right, from one mode of being to another is going to involve a lot of conflict, or has historically typically involved a lot of conflict. And here we see the peasants really getting really getting up on their hind legs to demand better wages, and the aristocrats attempting to use martial force to put them down. Problem is, we still have the same problem that we had back when the Roman Empire fell. There's no empire to marshal the army to put them down when they rise up. You have to rely upon this very primitive medieval military system of military service in exchange for land tenure, right? I give you the duchy of, Brittany, and you supply me with a certain number of knights, men-at-arms, crossbowmen, etc. That's a very dumb way to organize a military. It was the only option that was had after the collapse of the Roman Empire's bureaucratic military state. And so that's what they've got. It really sucks when you're trying to put down a massive peasant revolt that involves in some cases, tens of thousands of people, right? Medieval armies are tiny. Medieval armies are in the single thousands for the most part. I mean, the largest army of the medieval period was the army that went off on the First Crusade, and that had 20,000 people in it. And that was seen as a behemoth. I mean, Christ, one of the territorial armies of the Roman Empire was 10 times that size, right? So when we're looking at the medieval period, we're looking at very low levels of organization in terms of military, which means it's much harder to put down organized peasant revolts when they occur. You don't have the muscle. So the medieval system also begins to crack, not only at the foundations of the labor relationship between the peasants and the nobility, but also at the nobility's inability to stop them from rising up, right? For Hilton, this was not, therefore, merely a conjectural crisis, one point in an up and down of a cyclical trend. Rather, it was the culmination of 1,000 years of development. It was the decisive crisis of the system. He says, quote, during the last centuries of the Roman Empire, as during the Middle Ages, society was paralyzed by the growing expanse of social and political superstructure, an expanse to which corresponded no compensating increase in the productive resources of society. Basically, you have more and more people scooping up less and less production, right? You have all of these parasites, that's the superstructure, and less production at the level of the farmers, the people that make everything. Hilton agrees with Perroy that the immediate cause of the dilemma was to be found in the technological limitations, which we just talked about, the lack of fertilizer and the inability to expand fertilizer supply by expanding the number of cattle because the climate limited the quantity of winter forage. What we should underline is that there was no large reinvestment of profits in agriculture such that would significantly increase productivity. This was because of the inherent limitations of the reward system of feudal social organization. There's no reward for an aristocrat that saves money. There's every reward for aristocrats that spend all of their income in the year and then collect the next year's rents, right? He talks about this as a general crisis of feudalism. He goes on to talk more about the peasant revolts and pay close attention to this information on page 24 and 25. He says two things seem clear about secession of clearings and the recession of settlements. The percentage of small holdings abandoned in the course of the Middle Ages appears to have been higher than that of full-size farms. So you're seeing a decline in small landholders, right? You're seeing a consolidation process by the aristocrats who are gobbling up all of this land, which means the market for that like middle range of yeoman farmer is disappearing. That is putting an incredible amount of pressure on those peasants to make up that difference. And you have a constriction, right? You have a constriction of the potential avenues of escape for a peasant. So if you're a peasant, for example, in Hamburg, outside Hamburg in the 11th century, in the height of the Middle Ages, if you're industrious and you're smart with your money, you could aspire to one day attaining your own land outright, becoming a yeoman farmer, not being a feudal vassal of a lord, right? You will still pay taxes to the king or whoever the local sovereign was. I think in Hamburg it was a duke. So you still pay taxes, but you're not paying those. You don't owe like corvée labor or like labor on demand. You don't have to work the lord's fields. You are an independent small farmer. You can buy and sell your product in the marketplace at your whim. That is going away, right? As the small farms are being abandoned, as commercial activity is declining, and those people can no longer make a living, often they're selling to people that have money who are the large landowners. And you go through this period of consolidation, right? At this time of contracting demands for agricultural products, urban wages, and hence industrial prices were rising because of the shortage of labor bred by the population decline. This in turn raised the cost of agricultural labor while reducing rents. This led to what Mark Bloch has called the momentary impoverishment of the seigneurial class. Seigneurial meaning noble. Not only were profits diminished, but the cost of management rose. And he goes on to say this economic squeeze led to the peasantry becoming increasingly powerful for a brief period during the 15th century, which is expressed through their violent reaction to attempts to put them back in the bottle. He talks about the diversity on page 28 of production. And this is really important for Wallerstein because not everywhere is equally productive and not everywhere is producing the same kinds of products. And what begins to emerge into the early years of the development of this world system is the specialization of production, right? So we start to see the beginnings of the development of market, the market-based production, right? You start to see the development of market-based production rather than subsistence-based production. Let's go back to our farmer in Hamburg. When he grows his crops, most of his crops are being consumed by himself, his wife, his children, and their extended families. If they have servants, they would also be included in that kind of umbrella of family. He might take some of his surplus that he holds after he's paid his feudal duties and his rent or his taxes. He might buy small luxury items, possibly some silk or linen from the East, possibly he's really rich, some spices. Maybe he might buy a cask of wine imported from France. But it's occasional commercial activity. It happens maybe once or twice a year. As we transition into the 15th century, these large-scale, consolidated aristocratic holdings begin to see the wisdom of no longer just producing for surplus, but producing specific products for sale within a marketplace. One of the first places to do this is France, and it's with wine, right? Another of the early places to do this is England with wool. Italy, northern Italy and southern Germany become centers of iron production and the production of steel products. Germany becomes a hotbed for the production of this hot new beer flavoring known as hops, which is sweeping the nation. The expansion of the production of a certain type of crop or a certain type of product for the marketplace begins to change the commercial relationships within Europe. Before, you had this kind of occasional light commerce that's happening kind of on the surface, but not digging down into the depths of the economy. By the end of the 15th century, fewer and fewer people can survive without commerce. If I'm a vintner if I'm a peasant in, say, Champagne, France, and I am a vintner, like I'm growing grapes, I require the importation of wheat to feed myself. I need wheat to be imported because I'm not growing it at home. I'm growing grapes. All of my land is for the growing of grapes and the production of wine and the sale of that wine for not for kind, but for cash. That cash that I then use to purchase grain, which is grown out in Ukraine and Poland. right? Or in parts of Germany, right? The specialization of production that emerges after this kind of seigniorial crisis is really what's beginning to drive this interconnected network. In addition to this, you begin to see the emergence of more and more powerful kings. The aristocrats, during this period of impoverishment in the 15th century, lose ground to powerful monarchs who they had always contended with. We often think of the aristocracy and the monarchy being on the same side of history. But the reality is, monarchs and aristocrats were constantly fighting over who owed what to who had which duties and responsibilities, how much power did the king actually have, was largely up to how strong or weak his aristocrats were. If his aristocrats were strong, he didn't have very much power. If they were weak, he had the opportunity to acquire more. And during this period of seigniorial weakness, right, or aristocratic weakness, you start to see these kings, these consolidating kings, emerge and create much more powerful realms, right? France begins, rather than like a patchwork of semi-autonomous duchies, and counties begins to be shoved into a single royal framework. Brittany and Burgundy are able to kind of maintain their autonomy, but they're constantly like warding off the French kings of the 15th century. England, right, begins this process of consolidation. It first starts with Wales in the 13th century, and then it goes on to attempt to conquer Scotland, and it does reduce Scotland to a secondary power, and then it begins the process of conquering Ireland, right? You start to see the creation of consolidated city-states in northern Italy. They don't consolidate into one, but Florence controls its city and all of the hinterland around it. Milan controls itself and all of the hinterland around it. Genoa, likewise. Venice actually has holdings offshore, right? The empire over the waves, as it was called. Genoa has holdings up in the Black Sea. So you begin to have the emergence of these much more powerful late feudal realms that become the seeds of what will become the modern state. He goes on to talk about taxes and the difficulty of taxes. Taxing aristocrats is hard. They're very easy. They're very good at hiding their money. So looking to be able to directly tax the peasantry, regardless of what lord they belong to, becomes one of those keys of the emergence of early states. States then can manipulate the money markets by coining silver and gold coins and changing the purity of those gold coins, right? And so we begin to see the emergence of something that is quite unique in Europe, which is the nation state. And he asked the question, as we start to get towards the middle, why nation states and not an empire? Here we must be prudent about our terminology. Perhaps we should not think of France of the 13th and 14th century as a nation state, of France of the 15th and 16th century as an empire, of the 17th century as a nation state again. This is what Ferdinand Braudel thinks. Why is this pattern of alteration? Braudel suggests there was, with economic expansion of the 15th and 16th centuries, a conjuncture stubbornly favorable and vast, even very vast states, to these thick states. In fact, history, in turn, favorable and unfavorable to vast political structures. Fritz Hartung and R. Mausner suggest the need for a minimum size, but also a maximum for the establishment of an absolute monarchy, right? This is the total domination of the aristocracy by the king, an absolute monarchy. Doubtless, the latter could not constitute military and economic units large enough to sustain an absolute monarchy. These are but hints at answers to a problem worth considering, right? What would happen to those empires, manqué, was that they would develop different raison d'etre from empires, right? Different ideologies. A nation state is a territorial unit whose rulers sometimes seek, often seek, surely not always seek, to make of it a national society for reasons we shall discuss later. The affair is even more confusing when we remember that from the 16th century on, nation states of Western Europe sought to create relatively homogeneous national societies at a core of empire. So we're not there yet. We're not worried about the 17th and 18th century. What we're worried about right now is what is percolating in this madness of a continent in the 15th century. And what is beginning to percolate is the use of the emerging state instruments that surround these absolute monarchs and allow them to consolidate their power. And as they consolidate their power, they begin to expand those same state apparatuses, right? Taxation, military recruitment, the census, like the literally counting of people and things for the purposes of assessing one's own wealth. Some cases, postal or rudimentary and early postal services, right? These kinds of apparatuses allow kings to reach into the lives and pockets of every one of their citizens in a way that was unthinkable 100 years earlier. The idea that a king of France could tax a peasant in Burgundy was insane in the 14th century. By the end of the 15th century, not so crazy. The Dukes of Burgundy might not like it. They might try to resist it. They might try to stop it through whatever means necessary, legal and or military. But it is something that's on the table now. And slowly over time, you begin to see the consolidation of power more and more, but not in the hand of a single ruler, in the hands of individual sovereign kings. And these individual sovereign kings, these princes, all have competing interests to one another. And their subjects thereby have competing interests to one another, even as they are economically integrated. So France and England are rivals. France and the Holy Roman Empire are rivals. France and Spain are rivals. All of those northern Italian city-states are rivals with each other, and sometimes France, and sometimes Spain, and sometimes Germany. Like those rivalries, that competition within the world system is not reduced by economic integration, it's accelerated by it, right? Because now this piece of the pie is growing bigger and bigger and bigger and more valuable, more valuable, more valuable. You want to be in charge of it. You want to be in control of it. There is an impetus during the 15th century for someone to build enough power to finally put the Roman Empire back together. We're not quite there yet, but that is what is kind of percolating under this, right? And so you have the forces of divergence, of separation, emerging as these different nation states, these different powerful centers of these different powerful kings as centers of command and influence in their realms. And you also have the forces of convergence, which is this powerful and increasing economic integration of Europe. And that convergence and divergence are going to crash into each other in the 16th century. So he goes on to continue to look at different scholars and the debates that they have, and that's all important. I want you guys to spend some time on that. I want to move forward to where he gets to jump into a little bit more of his own conversation. Oh, yes, he begins to talk here in 39. He begins to talk about Islam. Pay attention to this, right, on page 40. Islam's very important. Islam is far more advanced than Western Europe. But both Islam and the Western world are all suffering from a serious deficiency in the availability of silver and gold, right? The bullion, which is the silver and gold used to make coins, was sought to provide a monetary base for circulation within Europe, but even more to export it to the Orient. For what? Again, every schoolboy knows. Spices and jewels. For whom? For the wealthy, who use them as symbols of their conspicuous consumption, right? So, again, trade in the Middle Ages is boutique. But staples are where the real money is at. And more merchants begin to get involved in more and more of a trade in bulk staples as the 15th century emerges, right? Wheat was the central focus of new production and new commerce in the 15th and 16th centuries. Wheat is not valuable in small quantities. It is only valuable in mass volume, right? You're never going to get rich selling a sheaf of wheat. You might get rich selling several thousand tons of wheat, right? At first, Europe found northern forests and Mediterranean plains its internal Americas. An internal America is basically room to grow and expand, right? Foods may be placed in a hierarchy in terms of their cost per 1,000 calories, but M.K. Bennett finds this hierarchy fairly stable over time and space, right? Sugar, true, was a principal motivation for island expansion in the Mediterranean. But because of its mode of production, with sugar went slavery. With sugar went slavery. Write that down, underline it, put stars next to it, circle it. With sugar went slavery. That's going to be very important later on when we start talking about the Caribbean. It's going to be very important later on when we start talking about Brazil and the colonization and genocide of Native Americans and what happens to the West Africans who the Portuguese are beginning to trade with, right? This started in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century and moved westward, right? If food needs dictated the geographical expansion of Europe, the food benefits turn out to be even greater than could have been anticipated. World ecology was altered in a way which, because of the social organization of the emergent European world economy, it would benefit Europe. In addition to food, other great basic need was wood. Wood for fuel, wood for shipbuilding and house building. The economic development of the Middle Ages, and one must assume its crude forestry techniques, had led a slow but steady deforestation of Western Europe, Italy and Spain, as well as the Mediterranean islands. Oak became especially scarce. By the 16th century, the Baltic area began to export wood in large quantities. Bulk trade, right? Never going to get rich selling a single board of wood. You're going to get rich selling several thousand of them, right? So he begins to show you all of these little emergent threads, which on their own would not have led to the emergence of capitalism, but taken together spell the end of feudalism. And that creates a vacuum into which this emerging and increasingly wealthy and technologically sophisticated commercial class, these capitalists, these bourgeoisie, can step and begin to exercise their own interests and begin to seize control of the reins of power. All right, just going through looking at anything else I want to focus on before I tell you goodbye. Oh, here's another thing I want you to pay attention to. 47 and 48, he gets into talking about the exploration drive, or like what is driving Europeans to explore. And he tries to make an argument for that exploration in the context of all of this expansion that we're talking about, right? All of this, there's the contraction of Black Death, and then there's the immediate expansion back out on a different basis, right? More commercialized agricultural, market-based agriculture. That market-based agriculture's profitability leads to expansion into new markets and new places. You have new products like sugar being exploited, being grown using slaves. You have commercialization of grain in Eastern Europe. You have the commercialization of wine and wool in France and England, respectively. These are the conditions under which one might think expanding a market outward makes the most sense, right? This is already, by the time Columbus sails, a world that is increasingly dominated by capitalists and is thinking about money not in terms of, well, my money is just what I collect from my peasants every year, but money in terms of, I take this cash, I make an investment in this venture, I am expecting a return on that investment that I will then reinvest in other ventures, right? He gets into talking about why the Portuguese and why the Spanish. He begins discussing towards the end the whole process by which Europeans are the natural, under these circumstances, the natural people who would go out and look for these opportunities, because they're operating, each of them, as individual agents within capitalism. They are not the representatives of a government, even if they happen to be funded by a government. Christopher Columbus was not acting as a representative of Spain, even though Ferdinand and Isabella bankrolled him. He was, in his heart, acting as a representative for no one other than Christopher Columbus. He might have to placate the King and Queen of Spain. He might owe them tribute in recompense for the investment that they gave, but he's not operating as their like loyal servant. He's going out there for his own profit. And every conquistador that followed him through, into the Caribbean, into Mexico, into South America, into the inland of North America, were all looking for the same thing. And so was every Frenchman, Englishman, Portuguese, every single person who was coming to the New World to do business here, to exploit labor here, to take land here. They are all looking out for themselves. They're operating under the auspices of a flag. They will pay lip service when necessary to their political leadership, but ultimately they're working for themselves. And the emergence of that class of people, that conquistador bourgeoisie, is the direct result of this catastrophic shift in feudalism that occurs as a result of the Black Death. Okay, I hope you guys enjoy the article. I just wanted to give you kind of a brief overview of some things to pay attention to. This was, of course, not comprehensive, but just gives you a sense of some things to look out for. I wish you all well, and I will, if you see, I don't know if anybody's going to see this, but I'm coming in Wednesday, so we may have already met by the time you see this. All right. Be well, everyone.